In this session, we're going to be talking about the mind, what the mind actually is, what mindfulness is, um, the relationship between meditation and mindfulness, and then we're going to talk about the very extensive work in science, the scientific study of meditation and mindfulness. So, beginning with, first of all, what exactly is the mind? The mind is the entire spectrum of the subjective experiences we have. So it includes our thoughts, our emotions, images going through our mind, physical sensations, smell sensations, everything that goes through our mind that's a subjective experience. Okay? So this is important to make that distinction because often in the mind, often in the West, the mind is thought of primarily as being the cognitive function rather than all those other functions. So it's primarily everything that goes through our mind, or essentially everything that goes through our mind, including all of our intersubjective experiences. Now, the interesting issue is what mindfulness is. About 5 years ago, I got the five most commonly read and most widely read books on mindfulness to see how they were talking about it. And I noticed that there were a lot of differences in how they define mindfulness, but there was about an 80% overlap. And the 80% overlap I noticed was primarily in three areas. That is, all of them tended to see mindfulness as being, I'm going to quote directly from this paper, intentionally being aware of something in an open, fully present, accepting, i.e., non judgmental way. So being fully present, not being off, sort of worrying about the future or anchored somewhere in the past, or being concerned about something that happened before, but you're right there, present, immediate. Secondly, that you're open, you're not closed to anything, you're immediately open along with being present. And thirdly, that you're not making judgments either about yourself or about other people. And that's part of the of being open. So
Walter,
you can
sorry,
be, yes.
just a question.
Mhm.
What does that mean? Does that mean that when we're making a judgment about something, we're not being mindful?
There's a difference between the kind of judgments that we make when we speak of having someone having very good judgment or having very fine discriminatory judgment. That usually is, when we say that about somebody, we're paying them a compliment. And it means that they think very carefully, that they consider things very carefully. That's one meaning of judgment. The meaning of judgment I'm talking about now are these kind of automatic negative judgments we make, either about ourselves or about other people in our environment. So it's that type of non judgmentalness that I'm talking about. In fact, when you're mindful, you're capable of making, in a positive sense, really fine discriminations in your mind that allows you to be much more have much better judgment. Okay, so that's an important distinction. All right. Now you can be mindful towards yourself and you can be mindful towards your environment. So your attention can be anywhere and be mindful. And this is what we try to do during meditation. Now, meditation is not mindfulness, okay? But meditation is or mindfulness rather, is cultivated through the practice of meditation. A whole number of changes that take place that we'll be talking about later in the brain, your blood chemistry, and so forth. They actually cultivate the state of consciousness that creates mindfulness. So, in fact, when you're meditating, what you're doing is you're being mindful with your attention turned inward. In order to do that, you need to have something to rest your attention on. It can be your breath, it can be some part of your body, it could be a mantra, whatever, but something to rest your attention on. And to do this successfully, that is to have really effortless meditation, which is a much more successful, much more effective form of meditation than that requires effort, you have to be able to rest your attention on whatever that is in a really effortless way. If you put any effort into it whatsoever, then you're not going to be able to maintain the openness, the non-judgmentalness, or uh, uh, the um, the spontaneous kind of presence that you're there. So no effort at all is essential for whatever that anchor point is, whatever that point that you put your attention on.
And where does mindfulness per se come from?
Okay,
And why had you only 5 years ago kind of looked into it?
About 5 years ago is when mindfulness started becoming really, really common in throughout our whole society, in our business culture and our social culture, and so forth. And that's why I started doing that. In fact, Meditation, or mindfulness rather, has Buddhist origins, but in its modern form, the way that it's used in the West tends to be largely secular, and they don't focus much on the Buddhist doctrines, but rather on just the meditation aspect and the little practices that you do in daily life that require mindfulness, rather than Buddhist doctrine. So nowadays, there's something called mindfulness-based interventions, which are basically um, accepted as part of the lexicon of psychology now. The techniques that are used, there are things like mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based acceptance and commitment therapy, and so forth. So these are part of formal therapies nowadays. Now, um, every time you meditate, you're helping to cultivate the state of mindfulness, but basically, when you meditate, and if you're doing effortless meditation, and this is important to understand, if you're doing effortful forms of meditation, what I'm describing may not happen. When you're doing effortless forms, it always does. The first thing that happens is you notice that your breathing becomes very quiet and very slow. In fact, sometimes it becomes so slow that even in their first meditation, people feel that sometimes they've almost stopped breathing. And as their breathing slows down, their body starts to relax in very noticeable ways. And in fact, in the science I'm going to be talking about a little later, we know that in deep meditation, your body relaxes more than it does in the deepest part of deep sleep. So, one of the ways that scientists measure relaxation is by measuring skin resistance to an electrical current. So, when you're very relaxed, there's a greater resistance to an electrical current passing through your skin. So, they place a device on somebody that has two electrodes, and then they measure how easily the electricity passes from one electrode to another through your skin. When you sleep at night, in the deepest part of deep sleep, which is only actually about an hour to an hour and a half of sleep, that's all. But in the deepest part of deep sleep, you're relaxed enough so that your skin resistance goes up about 140 to 150 microvolts. Okay, very small measures, obviously microvolts, which are thousands of a volt basically. When you meditate, at the deepest part of meditation, it's up about 280 microvolts. So much more a relaxed body during meditation than in very deep sleep. Now, as a result of your body becoming deeply relaxed and your mind quieting down, and your breathing slowing down, this kind of drags your mind along. So your mind starts to slow down, and you start to have that experience that the thoughts that are going through your mind, you're less identified with them. They're more just like things floating through your mind, almost metaphorically, as if you're watching clouds go by and you're just kind of witnessing or watching them. You're not involved in it. They're just sort of going through your mind. So often that's the way people experience their mind slowing down. They still have thoughts, but they're not as involved with the thoughts. They're not as attached to the thoughts. It's more as if they're just witnessing or watching the thoughts. Now, uh, during effortless meditation, there are a whole number of biological changes that take place, and over the long term, behavioral changes that take place. And interestingly, these have been studied very extensively. At the current time, when I'm speaking right now, there are significantly more than 3,000 studies on the effects of meditation published in peer reviewed scientific journals. And specifically, in effortless meditation, there's probably as many as 1,000. I can't be sure of that exactly because I wouldn't know exactly where to find that. But there are two major sources of studies on effortless meditation. One comes from Dr. Herbert Benson, who's professor emeritus at the Harvard Medical School. He's professor of mind body medicine there. And he's written 12 books, published 12 books, and written 190 scientific articles that have been published in peer reviewed journals, a lot of them about meditation, and the particular form of meditation that he teaches is effortless. In fact, he's written a book called The Relaxation Response, which he constantly updates. That is one of the early books written about the scientific evidence of the benefits of effortless meditation. The other source of a lot of studies on effortless meditation comes from transcendental meditation. There's a number of scientists like Dr. Robert Keith Wallace, Dr. And in fact, Herbert Benson did some studies on TM, and others like I'm trying to think of some of the others who studied this. Dr. Orme Johnson, a whole number. And they have done roughly 500 studies of that are published in peer-reviewed journals of the various things that happen during effortless meditation. They tend to fall into four categories. Okay, the first category is studies of electroencephalographic machines where they study the changes in brainwave activity. Uh, and this is done, if you've seen people doing this, they have something on their head that looks kind of like a woman's hair dryer. And there's currently about 260 points where this is touching the scalp and measuring the electrical activity that emerges from the brain in the scalp. And at the time when I first started meditating, they had about 6 contact points. So the technology has improved enormously. So there are very significant changes in brainwave activity. Secondly, studies of changes in the blood chemistry, certain types of blood chemicals, hormones, and neurotransmitters associated with stress begin to be reduced every time you meditate, and the longer you've been meditating regularly, the less the more reduced they are. And secondly, you begin to produce a lot higher levels of positive hormones and neurotransmitters, and I'll talk about those later. Thirdly, actual changes in the brain structure and function. So actually, parts of the brain slow down and become less active and shrink over time. So there's literally less gray matter. That's the part of the brain that's associated with stress, and other parts of the brain that are associated with good judgment and so forth, mindfulness. These things literally begin to expand in size. More gray matter is laid down. So changes in the structure and function of the brain. And finally, studies in positive behavioral changes that take place in people who meditate regularly. So these tend to be longitudinal studies over time, where there are very significant changes in people's behavior on a daily basis. So we're going to start out first by just talking for a minute about the brain. The brain has three layers. Actually, the first layer, as in the diagram, is called the primitive brain, and it was fully developed by 60 million years ago. And in fact, in reptiles, that's the only part of the brain that is actually developed. So, in the period when the dinosaurs and the large reptiles dominated the Earth, up to 60 million years ago, that was the only part of the brain that had been developed. It's called the primitive brain, sometimes the reptilian brain, and it's responsible for autonomic responses, things that are automatic, like our breathing rate and our heart rate and all that sort of thing, and for instinctive responses like the fight, flight, freeze response. And it doesn't go beyond that. Now, about 66 million years ago, a meteor hit the Earth, and when it did, it was so big, it created so much matter or dust up in the stratosphere that the sun was so badly blocked out that there was a massive extinction, and all the great dinosaurs, the great reptiles, disappeared except for the few that are around now, like uh, alligators and crocodiles and so forth. But uh, massive amounts disappeared, and over time, as the dust settled from that, a new species began to emerge. What we call mammals began. This is not a new species, but a whole new phyla began to emerge. What we call mammals. And so a new layer of the brain was laid down, what we call the mammalian brain. Sometimes it's called the limbic, formal name for it by neuroscientists is the limbic system, but sometimes it's just called the mammalian brain. And that brain is what makes it possible for us to experience emotions, that part of the brain. So in reptiles, if you look into their eye, one of the things you'll notice is that it's just like looking into a piece of glass. Why? Because it's emotions that make us feel contact. So you look into the eye of a dog; it's an entirely different thing because they're a mammal. They have that part of the brain that we call the limbic system, and therefore the capacity for emotions. Now, part of the limbic system is something that's called the amygdala. It's right in the middle of that midbrain, the limbic system. It's about the shape and size of an almond, and this part of the brain was actually there biologically as a way of constantly scanning the environment to make us aware of possible threats. So, because human beings for almost 200,000 years lived largely just in small clans or tribes and didn't live collectively in what we call cities or even towns at the time, most of the threats for us were largely physical threats. So the fear of saber-toothed tigers and so forth. And the amygdala was there as a constant early warning system, sensitive to any changes in the environment that might indicate something that's dangerous to us is present. Currently, what's happened is now the vast majority of human beings live in big cities. They have a very weighted towards social and economic life where they're interacting with each other. And now, mostly the amygdala is attuned to social threats. So the threat of a difficult boss, the possibility of losing your job in a difficult economic time or when you're a certain age, the having a difficult person you have to work with, threats like possible threats from violence from your physical, from people in your environment and so forth. It's these sorts of things that now, or threats, say, of a test we have to take, or the possibility of us applying for a job and not getting it, or having to speak before the public, or something like this. So the amygdala is highly overactive. Indeed, in young people in the United States, there's an agency that's been keeping track of their level of anxiety, and it goes back to the 1950s. Currently, the average level of anxiety in young people is the same as would have been considered clinical in the 1950s. So this is very highly overactive now. And finally, the third layer of the brain is called the neocortex. This is the part that was laid down much later, and in human beings, where by many orders of magnitude we have much, much more of what's called the neocortex, which gives us the possibility of the higher mental functions such as logical and creative thinking and producing music and all kinds of things like that. So the higher mental functions are associated with that. So sometimes by some human behavior, it's hard to believe that. Okay. Uh, Now, in addition, we have a left and right brain. That's important because they need to both be operating and operating together. The left brain is largely operates consciously, is responsible for our awareness of detail, for the foreground of our experience. It tends to be logical, breaks things down to its component parts. It has a time orientation. It approaches things in an analytical and logical process, and it's responsible for language, that is, syntax and semantics. Syntax being the structure of language, so that's like grammar, and semantics being the meaning of language. The right hemisphere of the brain, on the other hand, is responsible for your awareness of the bigger picture, your awareness of the background, what's happening in the background. So, for example, it's the right hemisphere of the amygdala that's constantly scanning for those background possible threats in our environment. It makes connections more easily, whereas the left brain breaks things down to its component part. The right brain puts things together. The right brain is responsible for spatial orientation. It's more imaginative, creative, and emotional. And finally, responsible for abstractions. Now, if a neuroscientist heard me making this statement, they might be a little bit worried about this because, in truth, very often these two parts of the brain have to be functioning together. So, for example, even though language in right-handed people is the part that we call semantics and syntax is largely located in the left brain. In fact, to get meaning, we almost always rely on nuances, which are picked up largely by the right brain. So, for example, if I say to you, I didn't say that I saw John cheating at cards, it sounds like it's a simple English declarative sentence. And if we know which John we're talking about, it should have one simple, single meaning. Well, in fact, think about it this way. I didn't say I saw John cheating at cards. What does that seem to imply?
Or somebody else did.
Somebody else did, right? I didn't say I saw John cheating at cards. What would that imply?
That you just didn't.
I'm passionate,
Yeah.
and probably implying that he wasn't. Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't say I saw John cheating at cards.
Someone else saw.
Yes, I didn't say I saw John cheating at cards.
But he was still cheating.
Yes, yes, yes,
See,
exactly, exactly. I didn't say I saw John cheating at cards.
it wasn't John, but
Someone
It's
was
somebody
somebody
else.
else,
cheating.
right?
Yeah.
I didn't say I saw John cheating at cards.
He's cheating, all right, just not at cards.
So notice, all you have to do is a little bit of body language, a little bit of changes in facial gestures or use of your hands or whatever, and
Totally.
immediately the nature of the meaning changes. Why is that? Because it's a combination of semantics and syntax, along with that ability to pick up nuance that makes language function. So to be fully effective, we need to be able to use both effectively. So what I'm now going to be talking about are the scientific studies of the brainwave changes that take place during meditation and how they're actually related to mindfulness. So there are four types of brain waves that are studied by scientists. By neuroscientists. Although I have to say, beta waves now there's an arm of beta waves that are called gamma waves that even are faster than beta waves, but they involve things that going on in the mind that usually involve intense mental activity of some kind. And beta waves are, in terms of their cycles per second, are 14 to 38 cycles per second. Now, if your mind is really busy and you're having one of those days when your mind is just going like that, okay, you're probably producing beta waves that are up around 36 to 38 cycles per second, and they're probably very intense. That is, measured in microvolts, they'd be very intense. So when you start to meditate, what happens is, starting from just the point where you close your eyes, you start to produce some alpha waves, which are slower and more regular waves, 8 to 14 cycles per second. You start to produce those in the occipital lobes, and then gradually, over the first 5 or 6 minutes of effortless meditation, so whether it's a guided meditation or a self-directed meditation, if it's effortless, the alpha rays will start to move forward until after about 6 minutes, they're predominant in the frontal lobes of the brain, the executive portion of the brain. And also, and this is really important, it isn't just that they're predominant there, they go into phase synchronization with each other. So when you look at a computer screen and you see those little waves going like this, what you see is the crests and the troughs align. And what a neuroscientist would say about that is that this indicates that the two hemispheres are functioning in very good coordination with each other. So the left and the right hemisphere, for example, are well coordinated. But what they found in recent years is this is true throughout the whole brain. So it's true of the layers of the brain. So the midbrain and the cerebral cortex are also producing brain waves that are in synchronization with each other and so forth. So this means that the whole brain is well organized at that point. Now, alpha waves are there whenever we're feeling calm, relaxed, open, present, that sort of thing. And that's interesting because that's the state that we called mindfulness earlier. So when there's a predominance of alpha waves in the frontal lobes of the brain, we start to experience that kind of mindfulness. Now, after about 6 minutes, what happens is we start producing theta waves. These are slower and even more regular waves. They're 4 to 8 cycles per second. Okay, and as they begin to cut in little chains and become there, the alpha waves are still present. So it's a combination now of alpha waves and theta chains. And what we know about theta waves is normally the only time that they ever appear in abundance. That they will appear sometimes when we have a little creative insight, but not the only time they appear steadily and in abundance is when we're dreaming at night. But during meditation, and what most neuroscientists believe about dreams is during dreaming, what we're doing is we're integrating the various experiences we've had during the day, including experiences that involve emotion, into the subconscious. And that would mean also integrating it into the midbrain, what we call the limbic system and the amygdala. And so when we're in deep meditation, after about 6, 7 minutes, and we start to produce these theta chains, this gives us good access to our subconscious mind. So the door to the subconscious is the alpha, because if we don't have alpha waves, then our mind is too busy. Okay, so that's the door. But the actual container of the subconscious, if you like, is the theta waves. And then, and after about 10 to 12 minutes, we start to produce delta spikes. And delta spikes normally only occur during deep sleep. So normally never at any other time do they occur. But during very deep meditation, after about 12 minutes, when we're in the deepest state of meditation, we start producing the delta spikes. And they allow us to be in touch with that part of ourselves which is at peace with everything and everyone. And we have those moments in meditation when we just feel that really profound kind of peace. So What happens is when each time that people meditate, starting from their first meditation, these brainwave changes occur. And in fact, when people have been meditating regularly for no longer than 2 months, they produce those brainwave patterns just as effectively and just as fully as people that have been meditating for 50 years. The difference is that in people that have been meditating for 50 years, they tend to stay on, they tend to maintain the same brainwave waves when they're out there in activity, in daily activity. Now, if you turn to the next page, you'll notice that there's some brainwave activity represented by a device that was invented by a man named C. Maxwell Cage, and he was a man who had a PhD in psychobiology and also a PhD in biophysics, and he invented something called the mind mirror, which allowed you, when you were hooked up to an electroencephalograph, to look at a screen and see what was happening in your left and right hemisphere. So if you look at the diagram in the upper left-hand corner, it's called splayed beta. And this is one of those days when your mind is just going like this, and you're producing such intense beta activity up there around 36, 38 cycles per second that it drowns out all other brain waves. You don't experience any other brain waves because of this. Now, if you look at the lower right-hand corner, you'll see another phenomena, and this is called suppressed content. So, for example, you'll see there's no alpha waves there. So, because there's no alpha waves and there's very intense beta waves, people don't have access consciously to the subconscious. But there's some strong activity going on in the subconscious, indicated by the theta waves. And that activity wants to get to the conscious, but it can't because there's no alpha waves because of the intense beta waves. So, because of that, it might be, for example, that what's trying to get to the surface is a really creative idea that might help in the circumstances you're in that's keeping your mind going like that, but it can't get to the surface because of that. Or it might be some emotional issue that wants to surface that you'd rather not deal with or not rather not be conscious of because it would be uncomfortable. And one of the ways to avoid that is to keep our mind really busy so we have no alpha waves, so there's no doorway for that to get through from the subconscious. Now, if you look at the middle left-hand diagram, you'll see that this is where a connection starts to occur. So this is what happens when people sit down and they start to meditate during the first 5 or 6 minutes that I talked about, where they start producing the alpha waves. And then a little later, uh, what happens is that we begin to awaken the theta at the same time as the alpha waves. That's the right hand in the middle. And then finally, in deep meditation, the figure that you see in the bottom left-hand corner is there. We're producing some, although not highly intense, beta waves. So these are just conscious thoughts going through our mind, which happen most of the time while we're meditating. They're just part of meditation. And then we're producing very intense alpha waves. Okay, so that gives us that mindful sense where we're just quietly observing the thoughts, the beta wave thoughts going by, but not particularly attached to them. Theta waves are there, so they give us good access to our subconscious mind, and this helps us to sort of clear out the subconscious, so the stuff that's stored in our subconscious that isn't particularly good for us or healthy for us starts to be released gently and gradually while we're meditating. And we're also in that state where there's some delta spikes and feeling that kind of peacefulness. Now, that's what happens when people start meditating, and within 2 months, that happens perfectly in everyone who does effortless meditation. All they have to do is be regular,
The
and
awakened mind.
that's it. It's called the awakened mind, the fully awakened mind. Now, in people that have been meditating for a long time, in fact, one of the things the woman who wrote the book that these came from, it's a book called The High Performance Mind. Her name, I believe, is Sarah Weiss. I might be wrong about her first name, but it's Weiss. She wrote the book, and she first tested out this device developed by C. Maxwell Cade on a Buddhist master in Korea. And she hooked the device up to him. She had no idea what was going to happen. But he wasn't meditating. He was very active with the students, asking questions and interacting with them. She switched on the device, and this exact pattern that's there when you're in deep meditation occurred and remained the whole time that he was intensely interacting with his students. So this is probably what's meant by enlightenment, that he's maintaining these brainwave patterns through intense activity all the time, so he never loses them. So this is the effects long term of meditating very regularly, is more and more this brainwave pattern, a set of patterns that's there in meditation maintains itself after meditation.
Would it be there when he sleeps as well?
If if you've been meditating for a long, long time, people often notice that it's even there when you sleep, and you can actually watch yourself having dreams and watch yourself in deep sleep so that you never fully lose consciousness, and yet your body sleeps even better than it does when you're dead to the sleep. So it's because you're so profoundly relaxed that you sleep even better, and yet you never lose consciousness. So for someone like this Buddhist teacher, that probably would have been the case, that he never was unconscious at all. Interesting. Now, the next thing is, if you look at the right hand, the upper right hand, this is on page 7 now, upper right hand, you'll see that every once in a while during meditation, all beta wave activity will just disappear. And we'll have those moments when our mind is just kind of silent. And those are usually, by the way, the moments when our breath is its very slowest. And if you were measuring skin resistance, it would be at the very peak of skin resistance. And that may last for a second, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds. You don't really know, because when there's no activity, there's no measurement of time. So it's a kind of timeless state. And this happens to most people after they've been meditating for a while. It just happens spontaneously. But the important thing in effortless meditation is you can't try and make that happen. If you try to make that happen, it will actually prevent it from happening. It's only something that happens spontaneously, and only if you're meditating very effortlessly. So, the second thing I want to talk about here is studies in the changes in the brain's structure and function. So, one of the most famous studies ever undertaken was done by Dr. Richard Davidson, who's the head of the Center for a Healthy Mind at the University of Wisconsin in the United States. He's got a huge budget, and he's got a whole number of PhDs that work there, and got 4 full-time programmers and so forth. But he did a very famous study back around that was published back around 2008 that has since been replicated a number of times. So what he did is he went into a really busy startup company. It was a biotech company where everybody was working 100-hour weeks, and everybody was under huge stress. So what happened is, using the fMRI technology, and if you've seen that technology where you look on a computer screen and you can see parts of the brain lighting up and other parts that are quiet and so forth, and there's usually colors there and everything. Using that fMRI technology, they went in and they actually measured the average level of activity in the amygdala, which are, as I mentioned earlier, was the stress panic button, if you like, in the brain, and also what's called the the left hemisphere versus right hemisphere prefrontal lobe ratio. So in people who are very stressed, the right hemisphere of the prefrontal lobe is highly, highly active, and the left hemisphere of the prefrontal lobes is almost black, completely inactive. Okay, so in these people, there was a very strong, what we would call a right hemispheric uh, bias, if you like. In other words, there was a strong tendency for the right prefrontal lobe to be highly lit up, and the left prefrontal lobe very quiet, and for their amygdala to be highly active. And not only that, but their amygdala was actually measurably a little larger than the average in the population. So this is important. What we know from modern neuroscience is that every day your brain produces about 10,000 stem cells. About 5,000 of those go on to produce the next day's 10,000. So they're the mother cells of the next 10,000. The other 5,000, however, go to whatever part of your brain is the most used. So in people who are under a lot of stress, the amygdala is constantly active. So what happens is the stem cells go there and produce a lot of gray matter. So it actually makes the amygdala larger, and of course the right prefrontal lobe would become a bit larger than the left prefrontal lobe again, because it's more active than that. So they then had people go on a program where for 8 weeks they meditated for half an hour every day, and they had to go into a room and sign into the meditation room. So this is the way of getting a discipline, so they could depend on the results they got from the study. At the end of 8 weeks of people meditating every day for half an hour, effortlessly meditating every day for half an hour, they then went in and using the fMRI technology, they measured everyone again. And what they found, obviously there were individual differences, but on the average, there had been a very significant shift of the left-right ratio from the prefrontal lobe to the prefrontal lobe. Uh, and it was statistically quite significant. And also, the activity in the amygdala had really quieted down. It was less active and had actually had a measurable shrinkage in size. We're talking about very small, micro shrinkage, but it's the sort of thing that neuroscientists can now measure. And that was from only 8 weeks of regular meditation. So that study now has been replicated many times over. So we know that this is a solid long-term effect of people meditating, but you don't have to wait a long time if you meditate every day, very regularly. In 8 weeks, a significant change takes place, and that change continues and gets stronger the longer people have been meditating. So, finally, there are changes in what's called blood chemistry. Now, one of the things that they do in a lot of these studies is they have a syringe up in someone's blood vessels or blood veins, and they can actually measure the chemicals going through the veins very, very accurately. So, for example, each time someone goes into effortless meditation, during their meditation, there's two blood chemicals that begin to be reduced that are there in people who are quite stressed at high levels. One of them is blood lactate. Now, this also occurs when you exercise very strongly, you produce a lot of blood lactate. But in people who are highly stressed, their average levels of blood lactate are high, probably because there's micro tension in their muscles, the same thing that happens when you exercise, and there's macro tension in your muscles. And of course, blood lactate is responsible for bad moods, for not feeling good, for feeling tired, and all that sort of thing. And also cortisol. Now, cortisol is something that's there to have a very positive impact on us when a sudden stressful event occurs. It's a actual protector of our body and nervous system, and we need the cortisol to suddenly rise to help protect us during that crisis. However, if people are under chronic stress and the cortisol levels remain high for a long period of time, they're very damaging to our health, to our brain, to our central nervous system, to our immune system, and so forth. So, for example, um, if you have high cortisol levels for 2 years, about 20% of the part of your brain responsible for turning short term rather, into long term memories literally disappears. By the way, that's reversible. When people start to meditate, that's reversible. But literally, 20% of that part of the brain will disappear. Um, so, also, the other thing that cortisol does is it damages or has a negative effect on oh, I can't think of the name of the gland that's right behind the breastbone here. It's responsible for our immune system. Anyway, what happens is it actually affects that gland and causes it to produce less T cells, and actually over time, if it's a long period of time, causes it to shrink. So it affects our immune system. So it's not good to have cortisol. So in people that meditate regularly, if there's a sudden shocking crisis, their cortisol levels will rise very fast. In fact, actually faster than in the average person, in order to protect ourselves in that crisis situation. But as soon as the crisis is over, it immediately goes lower, and its average level is below the average in the general population. The same thing happens with blood lactate. It actually drops about uh, well, it drops about 4 times or 3 times faster than it does during sleep. So it's very effective in lowering both of those. At the same time, what it does is the meditation, the deep relaxation and so forth, begins to produce a number of biochemicals and neurotransmitters that have really positive effects on the way we feel, on our psychology, on our ability to be creative, that affect our immune system in positive ways, and so forth, and our entire endocrine system. So we start producing First of all, serotonin. Most people know what that is now. It's sometimes called the happy or the well-being neurotransmitter. You start producing oxytocin, which is present when we're in relationships that are going really well and we're feeling really good in the relationship. We're producing very high oxytocin levels. Meditation works the opposite way. It starts to raise your oxytocin levels, and therefore, this actually gives you the biological enablement to be able to have better or more positive relationships with other people. It actually raises the level of your endorphins, for example. Endorphins are the body's natural opiates, and so on. So, a whole number of positive changes in your blood chemistry. And what happens is the longer people have been meditating, the higher the general average of these are, and the more they tend to remain throughout the day, even though they still fluctuate. They fluctuate in everyone. Their general average level is higher than in the general average in the population. So a whole number of biochemical changes that take place that become increasingly more permanent the longer people have been practicing regular meditation. And the final comment about this is when you look at all the biological changes that I've just talked about, it's pretty evident why it is that behavioral changes tend to occur. People have better relationships, uh, they're producing a lot of oxytocin and so forth. They've released a lot of the stress that's located in the subconscious mind that sort of sets up our mind to be stressed by things in our environment. A lot of that has been released from the subconscious mind during meditation because we're producing the alpha waves and the theta waves. And during that time, we tend to release from our subconscious that kind of garbage. The midbrain is being freed up of the programmed in uh, negative emotional things that have happened to us in the past. All of that is being released and so forth. And the net result is that on every study that's been done on behavioral changes in people who meditate very regularly, that's important, that little rider that has to be in regular meditation. People who meet very regularly, meditate very regularly, all kinds of positive behavioral changes. So that's basically the science behind meditation. There's a lot of it, and as I said, probably at least 1,000 papers published purely on effortless meditation, as well as 3,000 overall on meditation. Thanks, folks.